So on August 9th of this year, word spread through the town of Ferguson, a majority African-American suburb of St. Louis, that there had been a shooting of an unarmed black teenager by a white police officer. And as details of the shooting were learned, it became particularly egregious, the latest outrage in a community that already had a troubled relationship with the police. The story as it initially developed, Michael Brown and a friend had been walking in the middle of the street when Officer Darren Wilson, a white man, drove alongside them and ordered them off the street in a verbally abusive manner. 18-year-old Michael Brown, an African-American, responded angrily to Wilson. Wilson then grabbed Brown through the window of a police car. As Brown struggled to free himself, a shot was fired, and wounded, Brown fled from the car. Whereupon Officer Wilson pursued Brown, shooting him in the back. Badly wounded, Michael Brown turned with his hands up to surrender. Officer Wilson then fatally shot him from a distance. His body lay uncovered in the street for 4.5 hours in full view of the community. Outrage spread. Brown was a sweet young man, a good student, headed for college, and he had been murdered. People gathered in the streets to protest. The police responded with riot gear, tear gas, and armored vehicles. Americans watched on TV in horror as a heavily militarized police force transformed the suburb of Ferguson into a scene like something straight out of Fallujah, the war in Iraq. Was this the police or the army, Americans wondered. Officer Wilson was placed on paid administrative leave, and a grand jury was convened as police gathered evidence. Over the course of the next few weeks, a different picture began to emerge. Police leaked a video that alleged to show Michael Brown on the morning of the shooting, stealing a handful of cigars from a convenience store, then assaulting a store clerk by grabbing him and shoving him aside roughly, and in general behaving in an impulsive, violent, and threatening manner. Michael Brown may have had marijuana in his system the day of the shooting. This new version of Michael Brown was no angel. A coroner's report is released, and 3 different examinations agree that Michael Brown was shot 7 or 8 times, but was not shot in the back. Initial witness testimony begins to change. New witnesses come forward. There are sensationalist claims that Officer Wilson was hospitalized with a broken eye socket caused by Michael Brown. The truth turns out to be that he was hospitalized with barely perceptible bruising, but enough to support the idea that Brown at some point struck him. The police version of events solidifies into this new story. Officer Wilson approached Michael Brown to investigate the robbery of the cigars, whereupon Brown attacked Wilson through the window of his police cruiser. Wilson drew his weapon in self-defense, and Brown attempted to take the gun away from him. Wilson then shot Brown in the hand, causing him to flee. Officer Wilson pursued on foot, calling for Michael Brown to get on the ground multiple times. Michael Brown then turned and rushed at Officer Wilson, and Wilson fired several shots in self-defense, killing Michael Brown. On November 24th, the grand jury, after several months of extensive investigation, decided not to indict Officer Wilson in the death of Michael Brown. The version they give of events essentially mirrors that of Officer Wilson's. And we know the response. Mass protests broke out in Ferguson and other major cities, largely peaceful except for some destruction of property on the first day. Those protests have intensified dramatically following the grand jury decision last Monday not to indict the officers responsible for the death of Eric Garner. The protesters carry signs that say Black Lives Matter and Hands Up, Don't Shoot. They organize on social media with hashtags like This Ends Now and Shut It Down. There were protests in Indianapolis this week, and there are more to come. On the day after the decision not to indict Officer Wilson, Peter Morales, the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, which is our denominational body, issued a statement. He said, "Our fear that justice will not be served is now a reality. Regardless of the reasons why a grand jury decided not to indict Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of Michael Brown, people are angry, frustrated, and outraged. We still have questions unanswered. We still seek justice." Now, Peter Morales received quite a lot of angry pushback from some Unitarian Universalists for this statement. How can you say that justice was not done when the grand jury process was followed? Do you have some new evidence, some people ask, that disputes the findings of the grand jury? And if you don't, then how can you protest a police officer acting in justifiable self-defense? Now, this is an issue where people have many different opinions and where passions run high. UUs do not speak with one voice on this issue, or any issue, because the freedom to think for oneself, to weigh the evidence and make up one's own mind is at the core of our religion. So I'm speaking today about why I personally agree with Peter Morales that justice has not been served in the Michael Brown case. I don't expect you all to agree with me, but I also want to speak about the larger issue of why I think UUs belong in this fight and why I think we should stand on the side of the protesters. But let's start with Michael Brown and the grand jury. I have no idea what happened that day between Michael Brown and Officer Wilson on August 9th. And I submit that you don't know what happened that day. And possibly no one but Officer Wilson actually knows what happened that day. So why do I stand here and say that there has been an injustice done? Because Michael Brown's death deserved a trial. Many people are behaving as though the grand jury investigation constitutes a trial, but that's not what a grand jury investigation is, and that is not what it is for. Under normal circumstances, the function of a grand jury is only to determine if there is a reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed. Right? It's a very low threshold. It's nothing like the beyond a reasonable doubt of a trial. Under normal circumstances, what happens is a prosecutor goes to a grand jury. He asks for an indictment. He presents only the evidence that supports an indictment. And 90% of the time, the grand jury gives him an indictment. The famous quote is that a prosecutor can get an indictment against a ham sandwich if he or she really wants one. But the grand jury process followed in the Michael Brown case was very unusual. It looked nothing like that. In this case, the prosecutor did not ask for an indictment. And he did not present evidence supporting an indictment. Instead, he just dumped a mountain of evidence for and against an indictment on the grand jury. Then he allowed Officer Wilson to testify for multiple hours, which almost never happens. And he asked the grand jury to just sort of sort it all out. This process is being treated as a kind of mini-trial, and the result is perceived to provide a conclusive account of what happened that day, which is Officer Wilson's version of events. But Michael Brown was not there to tell his version of events because Michael Brown is dead. In a jury trial, Officer Wilson's testimony would have been subjected to vigorous cross-examination. But nothing like that happened. When I read the questioning of Officer Wilson, it's hard to tell if the prosecutor thinks that he is representing Michael Brown or Officer Wilson. In an actual trial, Michael Brown would have had an advocate. So we don't know what happened that day. What we do know is that an armed police officer shot and killed an unarmed teenager at a distance. We have a witness captured on video. He's watching the shooting as it happens, and he shouts out in alarm, he had his expletive-deleted hands up. We know that multiple other witnesses testified that Brown was surrendering when he was shot and killed. That's enough for me to believe that this should have gone to trial. Not that Officer Wilson is guilty, because no one knows that, but that this should have gone to trial. That's not an injustice to Officer Wilson. In a trial, he is still presumed innocent. The standard for conviction is very high, requiring certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. And it's quite likely that given the nature of the conflicting witness testimony, given the latitude given to officers to defend themselves, that Officer Wilson would have been found innocent. But in a trial, Michael Brown would have had an advocate. Someone to ask far harder questions than were asked during the grand jury investigation. Instead, we get this non-trial disguised as a trial in which Michael Brown is portrayed by Officer Wilson as literally demonic. That's a quote from his testimony. Michael Brown is described in animalistic terms as snorting and charging, is ascribed superhuman attributes such that he can kill a man with a single punch and shrug off bullets as an annoyance, and before whom Officer Wilson, a trained, armed, experienced police officer who is not that much smaller than Michael Brown, is portrayed as a terrified, helpless rag doll, such that deadly force was his only option. And maybe it was, but Michael Brown deserves someone to ask some hard questions about that narrative. In the meantime, it has become the dominant narrative. A lot of people now think they know who Michael Brown was, and they think they know how he died. And therefore they believe that the protesters that are marching in Ferguson and New York City and Boston and Chicago and here in Indianapolis, that the protesters are marching on behalf of a bad man who is mostly responsible for his own death. All this for a thug and a thief is what angry white people are shouting at counter-protests. Don't fight a cop and you won't get shot. So it's been argued that Michael Brown should not be the poster child for any protest movement surrounding police violence. That the circumstances surrounding his shooting are just too ambiguous, that he is too unsympathetic a figure. And some UUs may not be comfortable marching alongside signs that say, "Justice for Michael Brown." But here's the thing about America today. If you don't like the current poster child for police violence against black people, wait about 28 hours and there will be a new poster child. Let's talk about Eric Garner, killed July 17th in Staten Island. 43-year-old father of 6, described by friends as a generous, genial man and a neighborhood peacemaker. On the day of his death, witnesses say Eric Garner had just broken up a fight in the neighborhood when police approached and accused him of selling loose cigarettes, right, to avoid the taxes. If you've seen the video of the confrontation, you know what happens next. Garner is clearly exasperated, he's angry, but he's neither threatening the officers nor behaving violently. He has his hands up in the air, he's completely surrounded. There's literally no way he's going to flee. When an officer moves to take his arm to arrest him, he pulls his arm away and says, "Please don't touch me. Please leave me alone." And that action triggers a sudden violent assault by the police. He is placed in an illegal chokehold, drugged to the ground. 5 other officers swarm over him, crushing his face and body against the pavement. He stops breathing. He falls unconscious. The police call it in, but no one moves to assist him, and for 7 minutes, they watch him die. On Monday, the grand jury voted not to indict the officer involved in the illegal chokehold. Okay, well, lots of white people are saying all over the internet, Eric Garner resisted arrest. So the moral is, don't do that and you don't get killed. So let's talk about Tamir Rice, killed on November 22nd in a park in Cleveland, Ohio. Someone called into 911 saying the kid was scaring people in the park, waving around what was described as probably a toy gun. And it was, in fact, a toy gun, a BB pistol. What happens next is captured on security video. Rice is sitting down alone at a gazebo. Police officers barrel right up to him in a patrol car. Rice walks over kind of casually, sort of reaches down towards his waist. Almost before the car has come to a halt, an officer opens the passenger side door, steps out, and shoots Rice in the stomach, killing him almost instantly. Exactly 2 seconds elapse from the moment when the officers arrive on the scene to the moment that Rice is shot and killed. 2 seconds. That is how terrifyingly fast your life can end if you were a black person targeted by the police. The police officer then radioed in that he'd shot a 20-year-old black man. Tamir Rice was 12 years old. Okay, well, lots of people are saying all over the internet, Tamir Rice did reach for his gun, right? It was a tragic mistake, but it was a mistake. Don't do that and you won't get killed. So let's talk about John Crawford, the black man shot August 5th at a Walmart outside Dayton, Ohio. John Crawford was also holding a display BB gun, a rifle that is sold in that store. A white man called in a 911 report saying that a black man was waving a gun around in a Walmart, a report that he later recanted. The aftermath of that 911 call is captured on the security camera. Crawford is standing in an aisle talking on his cell phone. The BB gun's just kind of loosely swinging at his side. There's no one in the aisle with him. There's no one in the aisle next to him. There's no one around he could conceivably be threatening. The police report states that they yelled at Crawford to drop the weapon, but Crawford continues to talk on the cell phone. He clearly has no idea there are police anywhere near him. They shoot him from a distance with a high-powered rifle, killing him almost immediately. If you're a black person targeted by the police, you could be dead in the blink of an eye. Ohio, by the way, is an open carry state. It would have been perfectly legal for John Crawford to walk into that Walmart with a rifle. They shot him anyway. A grand jury voted not to indict the officers involved. Okay, well, people are still saying on the internet, Crawford did not comply with the police's orders. Tragically, he never heard those orders, but the fact remains he did not comply. That's another tragic mistake. Comply and you will not get killed. So let's talk about LeVar Jones, a black man shot September 4th in South Carolina. As Jones is getting out of his car in a grocery store parking lot with his door still open, an officer stops him to investigate a seatbelt violation. He asks LeVar for his ID. LeVar turns and reaches into his car to get his ID. The officer begins screaming at him, "Get out of the car, get out of the car," so Jones turns back away. The officer then fires 4 shots at him at close range. Luckily for Jones, only one bullet hits him, striking him in the hip, and he survives this encounter. Jones actually apologizes to the officer, asking in confusion, "I was getting my ID. You asked for my ID. Why did you shoot me?" In this case, the officer involved actually was fired by the police, and he's being charged for assault. But if the episode had not been caught on a dash cam, we can't know what the consequences for that officer would have been. We know what the consequences for LeVar Jones were. If you're a black person targeted by the police, faithfully complying with instructions will not guarantee your safety. And finally, let's talk about Akai Gurley, age 28, accidentally shot and killed November 20th in Brooklyn in a stairwell outside his apartment by an officer patrolling the building with a loaded gun out and in his hand. Okay, do you catch that? The officer is patrolling an apartment building, a place where people live, right? A space inhabited by people going about their business. And he's patrolling with his gun out, ready to shoot someone. He opens the door, the gun goes off by accident, and Akai Gurley is killed. If you're a black person, you can be shot and killed just walking to your apartment because your living space has been militarized by people so afraid of you they walk into your home with a gun out ready to shoot. There are certain kinds of people, mostly white people, who like to dispense advice to black people on how they can stay out of trouble. Stay out of harm, stay safe. If he had only done X, Y, and Z, nothing bad would have happened. To that black person who got tased, who got beaten, who got arrested, who had got shot. But all that don't do X, Y, Z stuff is based on fantasy. It's based on white privilege. White people have the privilege of going about their daily lives without being harassed. But black people don't have the option of avoiding the police because they will be targeted by white people calling in reports of suspicious behavior, by overzealous neighborhood watch patrols, by officers using racial profiling tactics. Look at the statistics, listen to the stories that black people tell of being stopped on the way to work, stopped walking in their own neighborhoods, stopped entering their own homes. Just last week, a black man was stopped by the police while walking through a neighborhood in Pontiac, Michigan. He immediately begins filming this encounter on his iPhone so you can watch it on the internet. "Why am I being stopped?" he asks. "Someone called in, you were acting suspicious." "Suspicious? Suspicious how?" "Well, you had your hands in your pockets." "I had my hands in my pockets. It's winter. It's freezing outside. There's 10,000 people outside with their hands in their pockets." If you are a black man, you are a targeted person in America. If you are a black man, there is no magic formula you can use to ward off an unwanted encounter with the police. You will probably have many encounters with the police no matter how you lead your life, and it starts in childhood. So I'm talking to the white people in the congregation now, the white families. Imagine living without the freedom to go about your business unharassed in the public sphere. Imagine living with constant insults to your dignity as a person. Imagine living with the ever-present fear that today is the day when an officer stops you and you have to pray that you come out of it not in prison and not on a gurney, because you don't control that outcome. Now imagine having that kind of fear for your children every time they walk out the door. These are the last words of Eric Garner. Killed for suspicion of selling loose cigarettes in the street and for the secondary crime of arguing about it. Every time you see me, you want to mess with me. I'm tired of it. It stops today. Why would you? Everyone standing here will tell you I didn't do nothing. I did not sell nothing. Because every time you see me, you want to harass me. You want to stop me selling cigarettes. I'm minding my business, officer. I'm minding my business. Please just leave me alone. I told you the last time. Please just leave me alone. Please, please don't touch me. Do not touch me. I can't breathe. 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 This kind of systematic violence doesn't just happen. It comes out of a culture of fear and dehumanization. And that means Unitarian Universalists have a role to play in resisting that culture. Because our central message is the inherent worth and dignity of all people. And actually, it isn't just a message, it's part of our covenant. As a congregation, we are covenanted to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of each person, which means that we are promised to do that. A covenant is a promise. We are promised to resist the dehumanization of black people, the mass incarceration of black people, the systemic violence against black people. I imagine that we have a lot to learn as a congregation about how best to do that. I have a lot to learn about how best to do that. But there are many things that we could do. The first step is to educate ourselves about the society we live in and its history. We can pass on what we learn to others. We can host speakers and screen films. We can show up at rallies and community forums. We can network with community organizations. We can give money to national groups and local groups, money for supplies, money for outreach, money for bail. Did you know protesters get arrested? And if they don't get bailed out in time, they can lose their jobs? There are a lot of things that we can do, and what each of us can best do is going to be different for each of us. There's a group that's forming at UUI to begin to talk about and plan what we can do to further the work against systemic racism. If you're interested in contributing, please talk to me after the service or email me. But either way, I hope we can all come to feel the commitment in our bones that this is holy work. That this is our work. This work is deep in our history as Unitarian Universalists. We were abolitionists. We were at Selma. And today we should be standing on the side of the courageous young people who are taking it to the streets. The courageous adults who are working to organize and educate. The courageous elders who lived resistance in the 60s and who are still fighting that fight today, that fight for freedom. We should be listening to what they're saying about what it means to be black in America, and we should be offering our solidarity and our support. This is holy work. This is our work, and this is work that cries out to be done. Would you please rise in body or spirit for our closing hymn, a hymn that was sung throughout the Civil Rights Movement, a hymn that's been sung wherever people fight for freedom and justice, and a hymn we should be singing today. Number 169 in your great hymnal, We Shall Overcome.